So this slide is about decisions. Decisions that we take on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. And this particular presentation is about supporting people to make their own decisions about matters that impact on them. So you can see that in the slide, we make decisions about big ticket items. Okay, so for people living with dementia, a big ticket item might be where they're going to reside. It might be about their future healthcare. But actually, we make many more minor, small ticket item decisions when we decide what we're going to wear today, when we decide what we're going to eat, whether we are going to exercise, and of course we should be exercising very regularly and eating all the skins on our vegetables and fruit. So that's great to learn that, but we make our own decisions. Can I just get everybody to indicate to me whether they think they've made at least 10 decisions today? Just raise your hand if you think you've made at least 10. See, there you go. So you've made a decision, and that means you've made a choice, because you're not making a decision unless you have made a choice. And making choices and making decisions is an integral part of being human. Because when we make decisions, we are actually contributing towards our sense of self. It's very important. Now, I just want to say at this point that I just came in from Canberra last night, where I was attending a forum that was organised by the Cognitive Decline Partnership Centre. And we were gathering together to provide some advice to the Commonwealth Attorney-General on the upcoming national plan on dealing with elder abuse in Australia. And I want to refer to one of our dementia champions who's been a part of the centre. And I will say that at lunchtime, I will have my computer out and I will be playing the story, Teresa's story, Teresa Flavin, who is one of our very wonderful advocates. She is living with dementia, and she spoke yesterday, as usual, extremely articulately and so powerfully. And she did say that if you take away our opportunity to participate in making decisions about ourselves, we lose parts of ourselves, and we lose the will and the energy. And so she would actually say that being included and indeed being able to direct your own decisions about your own life is actually really important when you're living with dementia, because it in fact makes your life not just a better one, but I think she would say potentially a longer one, because the interest is kept alive. So what I want to talk about now is human rights, because this project works from the premise that people have a right to be supported in making decisions about themselves and their lives, and that people living with dementia have that right, okay? And therefore, we would say that it is a human right. And I'd like to say a little bit about human rights, because human rights are about guaranteeing freedoms. And freedoms to make choices is a clear freedom that we would think that we have. Now, the concept of human rights emerged after the atrocities of World War II on an international level, and with the formation of the United Nations and various declarations that followed that. Human rights are universal. This means that they relate to us as humans. We are all entitled to human rights. So that's the first point to make about them. The second point, though, to say is this. Many of us may feel that our human rights have been interfered with. This might be an instinctive reaction where you feel, but that's an interference with my right to say something about this situation. I personally am feeling a bit of a interference with my right to be free of sleep deprivation at the moment. But how many of you have instinctively felt on occasion that your rights have been interfered with? Can we have another show of hands? So it's something that some of us have felt. The point, though, is this, is that without any sort of legal framework to address interference with rights, we're not going to get very far. So legal frameworks are really, really important in promoting and guaranteeing our human rights. This picture here is attempting to demonstrate that the legal framework operates a little bit like a rail on which we can hang those human rights. So it gives our concept of a human right, whatever that might be, the right to freedom from torture or inhuman treatment I've isolated there, the right to freedom of religious expression, or the right to respect for private life. So it gives us something to hang that right on, to attach it to give it leverage, okay? I might point out that the right to respect for private life is really important here, because when we're talking about our right to make choices about our own life, we are really talking about the principle of respect for personal autonomy and the wider principle of respect for human dignity. And both of those forms of rights have been interpreted as part of the right to respect for private life, the right to control decisions about your own life. Now, in terms of frameworks, these may be international, national, or in Australia, which is a federation, they can be based in states and territories as well. In Australia, we don't have a national legal framework guaranteeing human rights. I'm sure that many of you are aware that we don't have such a bill or an act, but many countries do. So in Australia, we are particularly dependent upon the international agreements to which we are signatories. One of those is the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, okay? That is a creation of the UN. Another one is this one, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD. So Australia is a signatory to this international document, and it lays out a number of rights. It does not create rights for persons with disabilities, but it is an assertion that persons with disabilities enjoy these rights to the same extent as everybody else in society. Okay? So the rights that are talked about in here already exist in international law, but this agreement is saying specifically that people who live with disabilities are entitled to respect for those rights in the same way as everybody else is. And unfortunately, that point has to be specifically made because people living with disabilities have in the past, unfortunately, been subjected to gross human rights violations. So we need to take this step. And many would argue that we need perhaps to have a convention on the rights of older persons. I've been involved in some preliminary drafting on an international level looking at that particular issue. So why am I talking about this in connection with supported decision making? The reason is Article 12, which is called Equal Recognition Before the Law. Article 12 is regarded as the heart of this convention. And you can see what it says there. that people with disabilities are recognised as persons before the law. They have legal capacity on an equal basis with others. People with disabilities have a right to access support, and there must be safeguards to prevent abuse. Now, very importantly, the World Health Organisation, which is part of the United Nations, has specifically and explicitly recognised that persons living with dementia are people living with a disability. And this means that dementia care is human rights work. Every day, we are working to protect and promote the human rights of persons living with dementia. And supported decision-making has its basis in international human rights. We are a signatory to this convention. We have ratified it. We must ensure that we have this in place in Australian law and policy. So what then happened is that the Australian Law Reform Commission produced a report, and it looked at the extent to which laws in Australia were consistent with the convention, the extent to which laws enshrined supported decision-making for persons living with disabilities. And it concluded that not that many laws were doing this. And as part of its recommendation, the report set out key national decision-making principles, which it said that lawmakers in Australia should be striving to enshrine. And the four principles are that all adults have an equal right to make decisions that affect their lives and to have those decisions respected. Principle 2, persons who require support in decision-making must be provided with access to the support necessary for them to make, communicate and participate in decisions that affect their lives. Principle 3, the will, preferences and rights of persons who may require decision-making support must direct decisions that affect their lives. And Principle 4, that laws and legal frameworks must contain appropriate and effective safeguards in relation to decisions that affect their lives. So that's where we sit at the moment, and the work that's currently being done is to revise laws, change laws and introduce new laws so that those principles are brought into effect. So in the time remaining, I wanted to talk a little bit about what supported decision-making involves and how our project is seeking to further this within Australian law and policy for persons living with dementia. There you can see the definition that the United Nations has provided. Supported decision-making is a process whereby a person with a disability is enabled to make and communicate decisions with respect to personal or legal matters. And I might point out here that there is a difference between supported decision-making versus support for decision-making. The truth of it is, and we know this innately, that when we make decisions, we rarely make them on our own. We often seek counsel and advice from those around us. So it is a relational context. But when we're talking about supported decision-making, we're actually talking about the frameworks. We're talking about the frameworks, the laws and the policy that will help to further and embed supported decision-making within our community. The second thing I want to say about supported decision-making by way of general introduction is that you can see there where it sits on the spectrum. So when we're talking about independent decision-making, we're talking about persons who have the ability to make decisions on their own. At the other end of the spectrum, we have a situation where persons who, often through cognitive decline, don't have the ability to make decisions of their own. And in that situation, we in the project call that representative decision-making, where someone then makes the decision on that person's behalf. It is regarded quite rightly as a measure of last resort. You may have heard of the term substituted decision-making being used also. In the middle then sits supported decision-making, and this is where our focus is that on providing people who can't independently make decisions, to provide them with the support to make their own decision. And of course, key to all of this is the question of what does decision-making ability mean? Well, the common law, that is not the statute but the law that's made by the courts, says that there are 4 aspects to this. A person needs to be able to understand the information, the person needs to be able to retain it, to weigh it in making a choice, and communicate the choice in some way. So that's the legal test for decision-making ability. The common law uses the term capacity, but we prefer the term ability, as we think that it better also encompasses that concept of communication. Now, when we're talking about persons who lack the ability to make decisions on their own, the concept of will and preference comes right front and centre, because then it becomes the obligation of the person giving support to have regard and to put right at the front of the process, and it is a process, the will and the preference of the person who does not have the ability to make a decision on their own. And there we see that you can see that will and preference do mean different things, okay? Will refers to what we intend to do, reflecting longer-term goals, whereas preferences refer to our more immediate wants and desires. Both of those are extremely important in creating an appropriate and balanced and nuanced model of supported decision-making. So just in the last few minutes, I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing in our project to further supported decision-making for persons living with dementia. In this document here, and there are copies of this out the front for you to take, and they are for free, you don't have to buy them. This particular guide is a guide for people living with dementia, family members and carers. And it is the product of an extended research projects within the larger project, which have been interviewing people living with dementia, their carers, healthcare professionals and other professionals. So as a consequence of that research, we have set out a step-by-step approach for people giving support to those living with dementia. And it is based upon 5 key values which people living with dementia and their carers identified as central to a good supported decision-making model, including the person, knowing and understanding the person, respecting that person's rights, having regard to their right to dignity, and being conscious of the need to adapt to change, because dementia is, of course, a progressive illness. We also, in this booklet, set out strategies which we believe will help people to understand what effective support can require and involve. And you can see there that actually it can entail a whole number of things. And a lot of those things actually are relevant to anybody making a decision, particularly sharing expert knowledge. And you'll see there that quote from one of the people that we interviewed, Susan, a person living with dementia, who refers to the fact that she always takes the same friend when she goes to the doctor because she relies on that friend to translate some of the more complicated information. So that's that booklet, and in it we have created a decision support plan so that people can fill that in and identify what it is that they particularly have challenges with and what particularly they seek to get out of making a decision, and who their support people would be. So that's what the support plan looks like. We've also done policy analysis of aged care organisations, in which we asked them to audit their policies to see to what extent they enshrine supported decision-making principles, and the answer to that was explicitly there was very little evidence of that. And to that end, we have a second booklet, which is a guidance for those providing aged care in terms of suggestions as to revising policies and creating a model policy framework. Finally, so this is my last concluding remark, we have some resources that are available online, and you can see there that's the link to the Cognitive Decline Partnership Centre, and if you go to the tab on supported decision making, you can access a whole lot of resources. There are 3 webinar recordings that are available, and there you see that there are also clips, interviews with people living with dementia, and at the top there you can see that Teresa's story is one of those clips. It's incredibly moving. It features her 14-year-old daughter, who is her principal supporter, and is just amazing to listen to. And she is such an advocate for supported decision-making and how it is so positively impacting her life. And for somebody that was diagnosed in their mid-40s with dementia, she would say that having those good policies, those frameworks for supported decision-making is so important for people living with dementia. That's all I have time for today, but if you want to ask some questions, I will be hanging around for lunch. Thanks very much.